Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings with a helping side of salutations, and welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I am not joined by anybody today, or am I? We will find out. Tune in for the next couple of minutes. But I digress. Welcome and thank you for joining me today. And feel free, as I'm doing introductions, to let me know where you're tuning in from, where you're viewing from, where you're listening, or you just kind of mystically know. But to take that step back and reintroduce myself, I am Tristan Watty. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And with that, I also say hello to Ann. Thank you, Producer Jeff. As always, thank you for being Producer Jeff. Welcome. And yes, hello, good day. And we continue on having some fun. So I say, where's everyone from? Well, I have another kind of question for you, and feel free to put it in the chat. But the conundrum of the day is a lot of reading. But 2, would you rather have your game auto-save every 30 seconds, but it randomly corrupts 10% of your save files, or only be able to manually save once per hour, but every save is guaranteed to be perfect? So put your answers in the chat. I would like to know and see. And while you do that, I will continue to say hello. Lewis, how are you doing? D, nice to meet you. And yes, thank you for joining in, everyone. So this is an interesting one, right? So it's kind of, you have 10% of the time. So 1 out of 10 save files, let's say, depends on where you are. And you know what's going to happen? It's going to be that one critical moment that you can't get back. And that will be that 10%, right? So yeah, Deadlock, thank you for joining in. I would say, yeah, the once per hour. So at least I know, at least once in an hour, I have saved my progress. Because you know what has happened in previous times? This goes back to my childhood, which I'll spend 5 seconds on. There's a game called Digimon World where I spent hundreds of hours. I put in my memory card. It got corrupt, and all of that went away. And that's why we save and back up. And that's why we have the theme of today's episode, because the 31st of March tends to be World Backup Day. So that's why we like to have these episodes, to remind everybody, please back up your stuff. And why? Well, we'll jump right into that in a little bit. But if this is your first time joining, we go off the rails a lot here, but we also have some fun and teach some core concepts, because as the title of this episode suggests, we're kind of going into the Bonfire world. And what is Bonfire? In some video games, what it represents is a save point, and a little bit of a haven for yourself. So when you're thinking of your core concepts, when it comes to your backup strategy, you want that save, safe, and reliability to it. Because every great adventure starts with learning how to save your progress. And today's episode, that's exactly what we're going to speak about. What we're going to chat about is how exactly something like AWS backups, with the backup plans and the backup vaults and the recovery points and the lifecycle policies, can help you feel a little bit more safe when it comes to your saves. But it also has you pause a little bit to think about, okay, what services does AWS Backup cover? Is it just EC2 and RDS? Or is it DynamoDB and EFS and some other things? It's an interesting fact, right? And as I go, at least manual save 1 is good at worst. You only lost 1 hour, exactly. Right? And Lewis, exactly where I'm coming to. How does AWS Backup ensure critical business data securely stored? I think that's an important part, because if you're targeting a specific framework, let's say you're HIPAA, or SOC, or PCI, or even if you put the frameworks aside, I have some critical items that are important to my business. How do I maintain this? How do I think about this in a way that makes me feel safe and, I would say, resilient? I'm coming up with different words to make sure one of them sticks. And I say them 3 times for the other people on the other side of the internet because it's a fun concept to go by. It's an important concept to go by, especially when you're thinking about a large-scale organization, right? Where you have multi-account, multi-region, cross-copy architectures. How do you do this? Because once you light your first bonfire, then you continue on with this conversation, right? And this is where we want to stick for the next hour or so, is discussing how AWS Backup scales based on your organizational needs. Because when you think about resilience, what is the first thought that comes into your head? Right? It's, if something happens, can you absorb that? Can you take into account all the different scenarios that you might account for? Well, if we were to take this into gamer analogies, how do you prevent the game over, right? Because in a single save file, if that single save file in that one location is corrupted, then it really is game over for a lot of the things. And that's why you want to think about different ways that you can continue on to harden your bonfire, right? The analogy is still working kind of, but stick with me. Because if you have backups, who has access to those backups? Are there immutable backups? Do you have vault locks? Do you have a ransomware defense? These are all questions that you start to think about. Because when you start to get into, let's say, lifecycle policies, jumping ahead to Lewis's question, right? How do you reduce some of the operational risk? Well, that's part of it. That you want automatic procedures to take part in your backup process, right? You don't want somebody to manually have to go in there and click backup. You want some type of schedule, so at least you know, hey, this is automatically happening. And you get to that point of our original question where would you rather have it auto-save or manually back up? What happens if you have both? Will you have a mechanism based on your RTO and RPO in order to restore to a given point? I think that's the important the question of the day is how do you do that? How do you achieve that? And how do I maintain the audit framework and compliance needs with the reporting capabilities that we are needing? And that's how maybe you have something like the backup audit manager components built in to the conversation. But I think the first place I would like to start is by going off the rails and kind of let's jumping into a workshop, right? Let's have this conversation about something that you can do right now. If you were to go to disaster recovery workshop, right? Let us share out and add to screen, enhance, right? So this is a workshop that you can practice with and kind of understand and kind of go through some of the fundamentals when it comes to disaster recovery within AWS. And one of the key items is just understanding the different ways to think about, okay, when it comes to my business, what is the RPO and what is the RTO? And where do I need to be? And usually those things kind of meet at a compliance and cost perspective. Because you can take backups every so often. You can have different mechanisms. You can have all these pieces in play. But what is your objective that you're trying to achieve when you're doing such backups? And how do you know, hey, what can my business handle from a continuity standpoint, right? Is there pieces of data that, hey, it doesn't matter if it's between 1 and 15 minutes. But at 30 minutes or an hour, then we'll start to have problems because that affects my business. It also affects how I say hello to Victor. Thank you for joining again. Right? So these are all pieces of the puzzle that you have to start to think about. And what I like about this workshop is you start to dive in and think about, hey, these are the different components that I can go about and kind of just play around and understand concepts, right? What are all these things when we talk about cross-region replication and resiliency, right? These are big items. And I always love Chaos Engineer, 1 for the name, but 2 just for, hey, it has chaos in the name. But I digress. The key component that I want to go through is, hey, you're thinking of disaster recovery. here's some services that you can go through and start to think about when you are having ideas about your backup and disaster recovery strategy. Okay? The other piece is, how do you do management and governance? Kind of where we live with, okay, CloudWatch and CloudFormation. What can you do here? Right? From an identity standpoint, this is often a topic that I like to kind of take the pause on and kind of take that step back and think about, right? Because you can have all of your backups taken at the appropriate time frames, but who has access to those backups? I think that is an important question for organizations to have, because if you have all of these items, but you don't have the proper, let's say, governance strategy or target state security strategy, then yeah. And Victor says, from my perspective, a slow process can serve good too. Yeah, as long as there is a process. That's one of the key items that often, hey, what we do right now is manual, but here are all the steps for what we do. I'm like, okay, it's a starting point. You don't go from crawl to run. You have a walk phase. And if your walk phase involves, hey, we understand where our services are, we understand what we're trying to back up and what our RTO and RPO is, now you can start to build upon those items in an appropriate way, right? So going down that route, you can see how some pieces of automation can kind of, I wouldn't say sneak up on you, but it can help enhance your overall conversational points. And another piece to consider, if you think about the shared responsibility model, right, of the cloud in the cloud, right? These are another fundamental pieces of, we mentioned taking it step by step, right? Slowing down the process so you understand all the different pieces is important. So when you think about the shared responsibility model, that should be something that you should be considering, is how do I understand what AWS is responsible for versus what I'm responsible for? And when it comes to the data portion and backing up your own personal data, usually the case that you're in charge of backing up your data. So how do I do this, right? That's kind of the next step that you take. Because when you think about backups, the important thing to consider is, all right, one, what do we have to back up? And then two, why are we backing up? Because sometimes what we see in the customer environments is, okay, we're just backing up everything. Okay, great. But do you need to back up everything? Are those logs from 7 years ago still needed, right? If there's no compliance item, that kind of goes with that. So I think that's one of the key, I would say, ways to think about cost benefits, right? Compared to traditional backups. Because I think when you are looking and evaluating your backups, you have such an ability to scale from multiple directions that usually when you are migrating to the AWS cloud, you start to think about the questions I was just posing is, what do we need to back up? And why do we need to back this up? Because what you're seeing is like, hey, we can do all of this and we have the ability to scale our backups. Okay, great. But usually when you start to have the conversations around cost, now you start to think about, okay, do we need all the VPC flow logs captured somewhere? Or can we take that step back and think about it this way? What is our actual data that is needed? What do we need for audits? What do we need for forensics? Those are the kind of questions you start to pose to yourself and your team, because we have different data classifications for a reason. We have different data storage tiers, right? Because maybe you don't back up certain things. Maybe you position in a way that, hey, this transitions to Glacier at some point in time, right? And this is where you start to go down the route of questioning things. And you always want to question, because it's an interesting thing. And troublemakers like it's interesting, Victor. When you start to think about it, it's like, all right, are people going down a known route, or are people trying to make their own route? And by making their own route, they're making, let's say, their route a little bit more difficult, right? Because these are things that you start to think about is, hey, there are known backup patterns. There are known ways to operate. So why are you following that way or not following that way? I think it's a question to think about a little bit. So essentially, when you think of the backup like audit frameworks, right, and the backup strategies, that's kind of where you have the quest log, right? Everybody wants to see a quest log with some details of, oh, where do we go? Where do we do this? How do we do this? If you ever have a question, you say, okay, well, what are we doing again? That's kind of where the core concepts come into play, because you want to build out your strategy first and figuring out, hey, why backups matter, especially AWS backups. Well, because before you can save your progress, you need to understand the save system itself. So if I take that step back, AWS Backup, fully managed, centralized backup service that eliminates the fragmentedness of, service by service approaches, right? So if we were to take that into account, think of it this way. Instead of relying on, let's say, an individual team to manually manage RDS snapshots or EBS snapshots or DynamoDB, point in time, you can have something to centralize and provide that single control plane in order to do this and execute on this. That's kind of where you start to have the conversations, right? And the core building blocks of your backup strategy comes from, one, understanding, the save system itself, and then two, continuing to build upon that to understand, okay, what is the anatomy of a backup strategy? It's things that work together. That's key to a good backup strategy, is things should work, right? Those are the building blocks. So things like a backup plan is an important item because you're defining the schedule, the frequency, the rules of when a backup should occur. And that synchrony comes into, I think, play when you start to have more complex systems. When you start to think about, okay, is this running in such a manner that we don't want to take backups at this point in time, right? And those are kind of the conversations you start to think about is, can we take backups right now? Or what is the minimum rate we can take backups? Do we have our systems configured in such a way that, okay, if we take up backups hourly, what are the potential risks to our systems and our environment? Are there any risks? Or is everything great? Or is it just a cost item? I think that's a key component to think about, right? So when you create a backup plan, what you want to do is you want to start to think about these key concepts. Hey, do you want to create your own backup plan? Do you want to build a new one? Do you want to leverage the CLI to do this? Hey, if you're just starting out and you're migrating, hey, if we have something that we can leverage from a framework perspective, then that might be something you can take and evolve into your own. By starting out with the foundational steps, then you can start to get to a point where, okay, this is what's unique to our organization. And to answer Lewis's question, what roles do AWS backups play in protecting against cyber threats? Well, I think the biggest item with this is understanding why cyber threats are a thing, right? And we've seen this over the last 20 years or so, right? Is something takes control of your data, and what kind of lock do they have on your data? If they encrypt your data, or if they delete your data, or if in the worst case they have access to your backups, how does that affect you, right? If they have access to your backups and they wipe your data, I think that affects you a lot. But if they take control of something, you're able to restore over it and not have to deal with it, then that's a lot of, let's say, relief that organizations I see feel, right? Of course, you still have all the compliance items that you have to fill out and the different points, but the recovery time is a lot faster when you have the constant backups within your environment that you take. And you're like, hey, I have the proper access, I have the proper solution in place, like AWS backups, right? And I have recovery points. And the recovery points are those actual point-in-time snapshots of your protected resources. So those are the pieces that you start to think about. And if you want to ever dive in, if we take a look at how backups work, then important to go back to the documentation and kind of look at the different services when it comes to how these pieces back up. Because if you don't have an idea of your holistic estate, what services you're using, what resources can be protected, then that's where you start to have a little bit of a hard time, because you can't leverage the solution that you're thinking of. You want to make sure that you have an understanding of which services, like DynamoDB and EC2 and EFS and S3, hey, these are backed up, and the AWS Backup supports it, right? But if there's something that doesn't support, then you want to think of another way that you can back up these pieces. And you might have to generate and create a custom solution for yourself. And knowing how long to keep your files is an important part of that custom solution piece, right? Because if you create your custom solution and it takes all of these different processes into place, then you might get to a point where you say, okay, is this the proper way? Or is this the correct system that we should be leveraging for our organization? Because I've seen customers have the conversation of, all right, why are we just leveraging this EC2 instance? Can we just move our databases over to maybe RDS instead? Because of the resiliency and the backup capabilities that they gain. And it seems like a great conversation to have at points in time, right? And that's how you support scalability too. Because if you have one individual that has to go into a database and they have to run different scripts manually and they have to double check, that's kind of where you start to slow down your pace, right? And Victor says, seems like a step further than a bad actor. Yeah. So that's the thing, is you have to consider all these different, let's say, models. When I say models, I'm thinking of like, hey, what is your attack surface? You have insider threats, you have potential external actors, you have all these different items to consider. And that's why when you are developing your target state security strategy and your backup strategy and your compliance standards, it's important to keep all these pieces in the back of your head. Because when it comes to just overall, hey, we'll just back up everything, I would say map your attention to your regulatory requirements, because different compliance frameworks mandate a different minimum period of time to keep something. Right? And that's just from a compliance standard. Your business may have different needs for it, but usually past 6-7 years, depending on it plays out differently, right? Because one, what is the data that you're recovering that is 7 years old that you need right now or at any point? It's a question to ask. Then the other piece of that is, once we understand how long to keep the data, is how fast can we get this back, right? Because that's where the RPO and RTO targets come into play. Because now you start to think of your data criticality. Because if you have that RPO, the recovery point objective, now you can start to think about, okay, what is the maximum acceptable amount of data loss measured in time? And it's interesting because I had conversations, and I used to do a lot of work with email and email servers, right? And you would look at, hey, there's a large email server failure, right, for a city. let's say. And in that, if you're able to recover 99.9999, there's still that one person that had the one email, right? Is that acceptable to not be able to recover because of the time differences of when the backup was taken and when this email was received, right? And Mike also says outage probably would be the only time. That's an interesting item, right? Because audits are usually the time where all of the tech debt you've acquired throughout the year usually comes into play, right? Because you start to think about, hey, do we have this documentation? Do we have our strategy? Do we have a path forward? And that's where internal audits and external audits usually play a role in this, right? And thank you for that question or statement, Mike. So when you start to think about building out your retention strategies, then you start to think about the patterns and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and how you can overarchingly cost optimize. Because usually there's a balance between the IT tech person, security person, and the business, and what the cost of these items are. But it's important to understand, hey, this is our save point. So we have to align somewhere. And usually, going back to Mike's point, audits usually play that part because audit is usually that piece of documentation that outlines, hey, you are out of compliance, or you should consider these things. Because the balance is a real thing. And these are conversations that are had day in and day out, outside of backup day. And hopefully, these conversations are not had during an incident or during the need for a backup, where there's that critical piece of data that, hey, we need to get back. And where is it? I do not see it in our backups. Well, what was the schedule? What's the schedule? Right? And those are the kind of conversation we're trying to avoid. So how do we do this? Well, we think about how do we light our first bonfire, our first save point? We understand the system. We understand scheduling. Where do you go from there, right? We want to think about it in that manner, fashion, form, and way. Right? It's something to get excited about because you're starting to think about, hey, I have to light my first bonfire. I can create a backup plan, and I could just target it. I don't have to back up everything all at once. I can take the first step into, hey, there's this one S3 bucket. Let's set a schedule every night, 2 a.m. Let's do this, see what happens. What are the retention? And kind of go from there, right? RPO, RTO, right? These are the kind of things that you want to have the question about and kind of understand. And that's where you start building out. And that's how you verify. Because the other piece of this is the verification part. Backups. You trust, but you verify. Because sometimes what happens is you may think, hey, my backups are working. But you may get to the point of, hey, when's the last time we tested this database recovery process? Oh, let's test it at this date. Oh, what did we discover? There's corruption in the database. So if we try and recover it, there throws an error. Those are things that it's good to uncover when you're testing, when you have that plan in place. The other thing to think about is kind of how do we continue to expand and build out? Well, I think the easiest way to do this is to think about it from what are the current frameworks that we can leverage? What are the legends that we have at our disposal? Maybe of a side quest variety. So that's where we get into this segment, this piece of the show, as Side Quest Legend Has It, right? And if this is your first time, as Side Quest Legend Has It, it's pretty much that visual representation with a side of, I would say, interesting music, tavern music, as I think, as you start to go on and apply kind of all the thoughts we have into our scenarios. So let us bring up our side quest board. If the side quest board comes up. So let me try it one more time. If not, we will continue speaking about said side quest board, right? So one of the things to think about when we're going on our adventure, or on our quest, on our way to understanding, is we have to think about who our customer is. What is their background? So by doing so, we start to get to a point of, right, understanding, of clarity, of trying to think about data in a different way. Because if we have, let's say, digital entertainment, for example, as one of our pieces of the puzzle, then I would say that's an important piece to consider. Why? Oh, let's put the name of Iron Forge, right? That sounds like a digital entertainment place, right? Maybe they have locked down their data perimeter. They migrated their live streaming global platform to the AWS cloud, and now they're starting to get to a point where maybe we have some other things going on, because we have centralized logging, we have patterns that are known, but we still have backup strategies we have to consider, right? And they also have SCPs. Of course they have SCPs. But then a save file, some data is corrupted. So how do we recover from this? Okay, let's check when the last time the Bonfire was saved. When the last time it was tested. Well, it hasn't been in months. That is the item that you don't want to hear as an administrator, as a person who, kind of administrates the backups, right? So the way we can do this, as I try and get the camera ready, is to go about it in a certain way. And what is that said way? Well, let's think of it this way. If we're on a side quest, usually things happen at when? Let's say 2:47 in the morning, right? That's usually the case for these type of things. So if you think about, hey, when and how do we take our backups? In our example of Iron Forge Entertainment, we think about, hey, maybe they don't have a centralized backup solution. Well, if they don't have a centralized backup solution, what else do they not have? Oh, there's no cross-account backup isolation. Well, I think that's also another piece of it. So if there's no centralized backup solution, then you don't have the capabilities to bring all of your different service pieces under one backup umbrella, right? Because if you have something like AWS Backup as the single centralized backup management plan across all of your accounts, especially in this scenario, then you start to get to the place of, I would say, understanding. And that understanding is, all right, we have backups, but they're kind of scattered. And usually what happens when scattered backups occur is the documentation is also scattered. And that scattered documentation brings upon a good amount of, let's say, non-trust. All right. So I know I can go about this for a long time, but I think the key item that I would want to take that step back and hit the Zach Morris timeout and pause on this side quest, because it's an important concept to get, is when you dive into the world of backups, you want to know that key thing that we keep speaking about, that I keep bringing up on the screen, is what is AWS Backup? That's why I take the dramatic pause. Because when you think of your backup, right, there's a lot of different pieces to your overall puzzle, right? And then Victor, once a failure removed, backup not needed can be restored over the identity, audit, or incident response plan like logging or trace. Well, that's the interesting thing. If you have somebody that's new to the cloud or new to just backup processes in general, how do you handle that? You need a backup strategy. You need the documentation. You need some way to fix this, right? So I think a good way to think about this is, hey, if I was on vacation, if I was on an island somewhere, well, how do I deal with this? You're not supposed to. That's the key piece of this. If you're on vacation, you're on vacation, right? You should have the documentation, the automatic procedures, the failovers in place. So with you being on the beach somewhere, I would say eating a coconut, you're able to relax because your backup policies and procedures are in place. You have your different pieces like, hey, I already know how we handle backup vaults within the environment. I know we have SCPs, right? Because when you start to think about it, what are some of the dangers that you can have when it comes to your environment? Well, part of the dangers is what happens if somebody is trying to corrupt your save file, right? How do we harden this against potential insider threats or a ransomware or accidental, right? Because insider threat, but you're on vacation and then your other person is not. Maybe they will sabotage the backups. Well, this is the piece that you want to focus on and think about is, how do I make my backups a little bit more immutable? And that's where you dive into the documentation in this section of just learning how backup vault creation is deleted. And then how do I have logically air-gapped vaults, right? These are all pieces of the puzzle that I highly suggest going through the documentation, just taking a look at. Because it's all part of your overarching strategy. Right? It's so mean, but they didn't get to drink the coconut juice or something with you, so they'll say, the backups. But I digress because I could keep going with that analogy. The main part is you have your resources that you're backing up. But the question I pose to chat is, what else is part of your backup strategy? Is it infrastructure as code? Right? Do you have CloudFormation or Terraform state files or something along those lines that you need to back up? Do you have secrets and encryption keys, IAM policies and roles, DNS records, right? Container images. Which one of those should be part of your backup strategy? I think it's an interesting question because should you back up DNS records? Feel free, put it in the chat. But the main thing is, what you're trying to stay away from is that compliance challenge that you kind of face. And what is that? Well, it's trust me, we have backups, which is usually not enough to deal with, right? So what you're trying to do is understanding that if you have a gap between having a backup policy and proving that it's being enforced, you want to figure out a way to close that gap. Because the other side of this is, can we close this gap efficiently? What I mean by that is audit fatigue. Audit fatigue is a really prevalent thing, where if you have the operational manual backup compliance reporting in place, then that means you have the operational burden of backup compliance auditing or reporting manually. So scale that by your organization. Is it scalable? And that's where you start to go into, okay, what are different solutions to help me out with those kind of pieces? And I think a big piece of that is just learning critical stuff like, hey, what is Audit Backup Manager? Right? How does it integrate with AWS Backups? I think the key piece of this is understanding these questions. Am I backing up? Are all the backups? Are my backups? These are all the three phrases that you often hear whispered throughout the hallways or in meeting rooms. Because what you're trying to do is figure out what is your backup frequency across your real estate, right? So when you start to go down this, it starts to be interesting if you have manual reports. Because if you have retention needs or if you have cross-region copy compliance, do you have data residency that you have to take into effect? If there is corruption, right, it's interesting. Because now, Victor, this is a kind of interesting point, right? So if you have corruption somewhere, maybe in your CloudFormation, your Terraform, how do you handle that, right, in your IAC code? Because now you have to get back to a point where when was it not corrupted? And that's kind of where you start to get to, okay, maybe there was something inside of the code itself. And that's why I always suggest running code scanners and testing and recovering to different regions, things of that nature, right? Just to have an understanding. Because if there's corruption, you don't want to find out at the last minute. But I digress. Kind of going back to the audit manager standpoint, this is where you want to start to figure out, hey, how do you use backup, AWS Backup and Audit Manager and all these components? Well, you can import the compliance results of the AWS Backup Audit Manager controls to your AWS Audit Manager frameworks, i.e., you have an automatic process to help you produce some reports in an automated fashion. I keep saying automated because that is a key word and term to take away from this situation. Because what you do not want to have is manual processes when it comes to the backups, right? Because oftentimes that usually sits with a couple of people, right? And that's not a good thing for continuity and scalability and all those good things. And as Mike says, also setting password rotation. So if you're hacked, it will reset. So the window they have to hack is limited, right? I think part of that conversation is interesting because having your day-to-day password and your administrative password and being able to assume roles is an important concept, right? Well, I think having it locked down with MFA components and things of that nature is also a key component, right? And yes, well, Dart team have a different method, yes, right? And it's all different pieces and layers and steps and all those kind of things, right? Just like, hey, what ways can a centralized backup manager strengthen a company's overall security posture? Well, having centralized backups allows you to have that centralized vantage point. So it's not, hey, this team is doing their own type of backups in their own different way, right? There's a centralized governance approach, and then there's certain ways that you can secure it. And I think a key piece of that, bring it up, is service control policies. Service control policies, they become a lot easier when you know where your backups are stored, right? So understanding your org and understanding what policies you implement is an important piece of the puzzle, right? So I think that's one piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle is boiling down into, okay, if we are going down this route, we have our automated reporting, we have our controls. I think the piece that you're kind of thinking about is the monitoring aspect. And this is where we also take the step back to think about, do I know all these services that we're casually going through at a nice pace, right? Because there's a lot of services that are involved in here. And one of the pieces that we often suggest to go through is just understanding the key basics of AWS services and getting the certificate knowledge. It's a good thing, right? Going through, understanding security specialty, and a little bias towards that one, but I love it. So as you start to do that, you eventually get to go on your own quest of a side quest, of a knowledge quest variety. And you may say, hey, what is a knowledge quest? Well, thank you for asking, because I'll take the second to explain. A knowledge quest is those times that you grab, after your 5 a.m. run, of course, right? You grab your favorite beverage, coffee, tea, water, or something else, and you sit down and say, okay, what can I learn today from an AWS standpoint, from a tech standpoint, just from a security standpoint? And that thing eventually helps me to kind of build aura or help me understand the different mechanisms I need to be at a level 100. How am I a bonfire kindler? And that's kind of what we were going through before, of just learning the basics of what is AWS Backup. That's how you start being a bonfire kindler, because you ask the questions. You start to pose the right pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to solve. And if I take a step back to reword that, is you start to think about the pieces and where they go. You may not know where they go, but you have inklings of it. Right? And that's where you start to jump around and, hey, how do I do disaster recovery in the cloud? How do I kind of automate some of these different components? Till eventually you start to think about it from the, let's say, the access standpoint. And I take the good old pause there because you can assign different policies and things of that nature when it comes to this, right? But how are you monitoring that? And do you become a save point architect, being able to monitor your backup events? And the reason why I say this is, how do you make your backup events meaningful to you while keeping the automation in place? What I mean by that is, just like you have audit fatigue, you can have message fatigue and say backup completed, backup completed, backup completed. But what I've seen with customers in the past is, as long as they get the A-OK, hey, this backup succeeded, how often do they verify that something didn't go on or something didn't go wrong? Or how do they verify that maybe they have system slowdowns or something along those lines when they're running their process and procedure, and that's the way, based on their current backup strategy, is happening, right? Should we be taking those backups during the middle of the day, for example, right? When you have the most user loads and you have to scale up and it takes a few minutes and then you do these kind of things. Or do you start to have a different mechanism, like using EventBridge to help you out with the monitoring, to say, hey, failed, completed, running, aborted, expired. All these are great things. But how is this unique to my organization? Right? I think this is unique, not from the way that you think about it. It's unique that you're following the baseline first. Because oftentimes is when you're starting to get used to a backup, you just run the backup and see what happens, right? Seeing customers do that, and it's like, okay, now we'll go back and redo our strategy. And oftentimes that strategy becomes complicated when you do that, because now usually what happens is productions and things of that nature start to come into play, right? And when production's involved, you start to get a different feeling. You start to have that kind of build up of different thoughts of so as you start to think about that, what you're trying to avoid is looking at your backup strategy and looking at it from a perspective of, okay, something just happened, right? Something that I did not expect. And that's where you're trying to get to the point of, no, I do not want to hear that. I want to hear upbeat, happy. I want to have the applause going, right? So how do you do that? Well, monitoring. That's a key part, because backups could be working until they're not. And one of the pieces of that is monitoring. And I've had many conversations recently with customers when it came to the backup strategy. And that was one of the things that we're missing, of like, hey, we have backups and we're monitoring in this way. but it wasn't a holistic way. And since it wasn't a holistic way, something may happen, and that may cause something to go down, right? And if that goes down, then you can have bigger issues or bigger problems. But I think the other piece to consider is if you take the pause and a step back and start to think about, okay, operationalizing my backup compliance. That means shifting from the reactive, right, the audit driven, to a proactive measure, continuous compliance. Okay. And if I do that from a monitoring standpoint, that's a key aspect. Because one of the pieces that we can go deep into chatting about is how do I automate the remediation of non-compliant resources using Lambda step functions to say, okay, these resources need to be backed up or included in a certain way. But I think all of that leads you down, and there's a lot of L200, but going to 300 is exactly that thought process, right? This is how you become the keeper of all save slots. We go off the rails. So when you think of that, you start to go into, okay, how do I automate this? What is the concept behind something like a stack set, especially across my regions, right? Why is this relevant to my environment? And these are the pieces that we want you to dive into and think about it, right? Step function and vibe code is the most secure way for audit. Thank you for that, Victor. And you know what's interesting is you can get a lot of ideas from that vibe coding session into figuring out like, oh, I have this solution. Let me go to my sandbox. And I say sandbox, experimental you, if you're using your control tower in that specific way, right? Where you can have these pieces of data that you can manipulate, synthetic data, of course, that you can manipulate and figure out and back up and get to a point of understanding, and also helping understand how you do identity with those different pieces, right? I think that's how you become the keeper of all save slots, right? So one of the pieces I often suggest is just like I begun the episode with, is thinking about your identity structure overarchingly, right? And how your identity applies to your backups. And then thinking about just the pillars, right? And what of the well-architected framework. Back up your data. Back up your data based on your RTO and your RPO. Done, right? Easy. Everybody wins, right? That's where you walk off into the sunset. You did it. You hear the loud applause. You keep going with it. But it may be a little bit more difficult than you think, just for the reason of that's kind of looking at the game from the end credit screen. You want to start with your first bonfire. And those articles we went over quickly kind of helps you to think about it in a different way, right? Because you're starting to tear everything out to your bonfire kindler, to your save point architect, and eventually over to the keeper of all save slots. Because we are working our way up to understanding the different pieces of what goes into a backup strategy. And I wouldn't even put, successful backup strategy. I would put backup strategy for the reason of you're constantly iterating, you're constantly moving and changing and adapting your resources in such a way that it becomes second nature to your environment. And the other piece, if I were to go off on a tangent, since Russ is not here today, is you start to think about it from an incident responder standpoint, right? If you are said incident responder and you're trying to help out your own organization or another organization, okay, what are your backups, right? You have that question in there. And one of the things that you don't want to hear is, the backups have been tricky, or they've had issues in the past, or something else, because sometimes you're heading down one route, and if you're trying to meet your RPO and your RTO, you need to have a solid backup foundation and strategy, right? And this goes to Lewis's question: how can companies ensure compliance with industry regulation by integrating AWS backups into their security framework? That is an interesting question, because you can have a lot of different ways to do this, right? Because it doesn't just have to be AWS backup at all. It can be multiple pieces of the puzzle of just making sure, hey, I understand what data I have. I understand the frequency of how I have to back up that data, and then understanding my industry and compliance regulations, right? And creating a strategy from that from a more holistic standpoint. We spoke about AWS backups as one of the first steps that you can take, but it's not a holistic step, right? So if you're moving towards, let's say, SOC 2 or HIPAA or something along those lines, some regulations that you have to follow, then you want to make sure that you have understanding of all those pieces, as well as data classification. Making sure that you have a data classification strategy, because that all ties in. Where's my sensitive data? Where's my non-sensitive data? And with that being said, can I back up everything, or do I have to back up everything? Two different questions and different ways to apply it. And Victor, just recover the host and manage right data during the audit. just the one that's like, look, it works, right? Meanwhile, everything else is down. But I think the interesting part of this is when you start to think about it is you should have a multi-account and multi-tiered and resilient backup strategy, so that if something happens, and this is where we started getting a reliability pillar, then you have different mechanisms to recover from. Now you're choosing your next step. And that choice is an important thing, especially when you're thinking about it from the perspective of organization and business, because our difference could mean meeting your SLAs or breaking your SLAs. And that could lead to contractual items that you still need to think about. So when you think about World Backup Day that happens tomorrow, just think of it from the standpoint of, hey, let me take a second to stop and think about my backup strategy, so that I feel a little bit more comfortable, because the bonfire is lit and I have a save point that I can use that I know isn't corrupt because I tested it. And the only way you get to that point is by building up experience points, 1 XP at a time, till eventually you level up yourself, your security strategy, and your backup ability. And the last thing you could do, and I'll say it in Russ's absence, is make sure you have an incident response plan as well. Because in case of an incident, you want to know when to restore and when to recover, because it's an important piece. I was going to say you got to know when to hold them, when to fold them, but I think that's a talk for a different day, or maybe tomorrow. But until next time, thank you for joining me today, and join us next week as we continue on some of our fun. And you may ask what? Well, tune in and we'll come up with another fun title and theme for you to listen into. So thanks again. Take it easy and have a happy Monday. Thank you for joining. Take care.